Welcome back to another episode of Silicon Wafers, and in this episode we look at the extraordinary strikes that are taking place against Russian critical assets by the Ukrainian military. Before we jump in, thanks to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and of course everyone who is helping out with our fundraiser at the moment. That is for the 93rd Brigade, who are in desperate need of vehicles. Please do check out the short video later in this where they lay out their case for getting those vehicles, but it is absolutely critical at this time to support, and these vehicles will help not only increase Ukrainian resilience but also save lives. Let's jump into the episode. Ukrainian strikes are reaching deeper into Russian territory. A fuel crisis is brewing on occupied territories, and the Kremlin expands censorship as the war's frontline shifts. We'll dig into what these events tell us about Russia's imperial logic, its aggression, its failures to exert control over Ukraine, and its vulnerabilities in its war economy. And of course, the intensifying global contest between authoritarian states and the forces of resistance. We'll break this episode into 5 parts: the strike on Novorossiysk and Tuapse, sea drone paralysis of the Black Sea oil hubs, destruction of an AN-26 and radar in Crimea, the fuel crisis in occupied Crimea and other territories, and export bans, and finally Moscow's censorship expansion and internal suppression. Let's begin. Strikes on Novorossiysk and Tuapse, deepening Ukrainian reach. On September 24th, 2025, Ukrainian naval drones, part of the main intelligence directorate, GUR, targeted key oil and logistics terminals on Russia's Black Sea coast, striking Novorossiysk and Tuapse. That's according to Ukrinform. According to GUR and Ukrainian sources, the assault disrupted the functioning of Transneft's oil terminal and the Caspian Pipeline Consortium (CPC) loading infrastructure. In Tuapse, the oil loading pier at one of Russia's major Black Sea terminals was blown up. That's according to Caspian Post. The Kiev Post quotes GUR sources: naval drones targeted key logistics facilities belonging to the aggressor state on the Black Sea coast. Together, the facilities have an export capacity of 2 million barrels of crude oil per day. And Ukrinform similarly said on September 24th, strike naval drones targeted logistics facilities on Russia's Black Sea coast, disrupted the ports of Novorossiysk and Tuapse. And if you haven't seen the footage of these attacks, I recommend you go and check them out online. They are absolutely extraordinary. Ukrainska Pravda added the operation has reportedly paralyzed the oil handling facilities of Transneft and the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal near Novorossiysk. The source said these facilities were being used by Russia to load oil onto its tankers, including those from the so-called Shadow Fleet. Well, these strikes mark an expansion in reach, not just border or frontline infrastructure, but deep coastal oil export nodes that are crucial to Russia's war effort. The reference to the Shadow Fleet is critical. Russia has long used obscured shipping channels and shadow tankers to evade sanctions. Striking these facilities hits not just physical assets but revenue lifelines. The paralyzed infrastructure claim is entirely potent. If true, Russia's ability to move crude oil outwards is under severe direct pressure. Russian air defenses responded inaccurately, according to the sources, hitting civilian areas and triggering panic. There are also videos of civilians cowering, not from the Ukrainian attack, but from the misdirected fire of their own air defenses. That's according to Ukrinform. From a strategic perspective, Ukraine is shifting from defensive to offensive targeting of revenue and logistical arteries, a war of infrastructure and resource attrition. We'll now look more broadly at what it means for Russia's Black Sea oil export hub operations and how Ukraine may have paralyzed them. Let's now shift from oil hubs to Crimea, where Ukraine claimed significant destruction of transport aircraft and radar installations. How well they burn. Ukraine destroys AN-26 and radar in occupied Crimea. The Kiev Independent ran a headline, "How Well They Burn. Ukraine Destroys 2 Russian AN Transport Aircraft, Radar Stations in Occupied Crimea." Again, this is according to GUR. Though the article is light on detail, the claim signals Ukraine is striking within occupied Crimea, not just supply lines, but military air assets and sensor infrastructure. These strikes, if verified, represent Ukraine's intent to degrade Russian force projection and command control in the occupied peninsula. Destroying transport aircraft reduces Russia's ability to ferry supplies, personnel, even casualty evacuation. Hitting radar degrades situational awareness, particularly over sea and near the front line, aiding future drone or missile operations. Striking within Crimea also sends a symbolic message. The so-called safe rear is not safe anymore. From military asset destruction, we turn to the social consequences, particularly in a territory heavily dependent on Russian fuel, that is, in occupied Crimea. Fuel crises are reported in occupied Crimea, and now export bans, station closures, and extreme vulnerabilities are coming to light. The Kiev Independent reported the Russian fuel crisis escalates as half of gas stations in occupied Crimea halt their gasoline sales. Kremlin extends export ban. And further to that coverage, it says that the Crimea fuel crisis follows weeks of Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian refineries, fatally straining supply lines to the peninsula. Again, this is according to the Kiev Independent. Half of gas stations halt gasoline sales. It is a stark metric of the local breakdown of logistics. Meanwhile, other media, for instance, The Guardian, has already flagged this trend. One of the industry's main weaknesses is the lack of any real buffer in domestic petrol production. Output only just covers domestic demand, leaving the system highly vulnerable to disruption. Earlier, Russia had already paused gasoline exports external to the country, a full ban on gasoline exports until 30th of September 2025 for producers, and partial bans for intermediaries, now extended until October 31st. That's according to AP News. Oil price commentary adds Russia is considering extending the gasoline export ban for producers through October and even introducing a diesel export ban as shortages spread. Reuters also recently reported that Russia plans to partially ban diesel exports and extend the gasoline export ban until the end of 2025. Also, Reuters flagged that refinery shutdowns have disrupted fuel supply in Russia and Crimea alike. The fuel crisis shows the fragility of a war economy that is dependent on the revenues from such few exports as oil. Crimea, lacking its own refining capacity, is heavily dependent on supply chains from mainland Russia, making it especially vulnerable. The closure of half the gas stations is not only logistical, but a psychological blow. Frustration, queues, social discontent in a region under Russian control. And from The Guardian, here are some direct quotes describing the situation. "We've been waiting for hours and no one knows if we'll even get our cars filled," said one man as he drove past a snaking queue in the far eastern city of Galnogorsk. In many parts of Russia, citizens already live on the edge. Fuel shortages magnify the pinch. The intelligence from Ukraine's foreign intelligence services projects that this crisis will intensify in winter 25-26 across occupied Crimea. It's likely across many more territories of occupied Ukraine and indeed across Russia proper. A sharp escalation could ripple to supply lines in other occupied territories, especially where the fuel supply is already stretched and where the military has the first call on any supplies that are available. The Kremlin will increasingly rely on rationing, prioritizing allocations to the military and security forces, and internal repression will be used to manage demand and, of course, quell any dissent and complaint. But as the war presses inward, Moscow's response is not only military, it includes censorship, suppression, information control. These are all expanding as the economy spirals out of control. Now let's shift to the informational front. Moscow's censorship, expansion, and repression increases as the war reaches deeper. As Ukrainian strikes reach further into Russian territory, deeper into the economy, Moscow has responded with stricter censorship, media controls, and information domination. This includes the expansion of censorship laws and practices, tighter control over war reporting, social media, and unauthorized commentary. There are crackdowns on journalistic outlets, independent Russian media, which no longer really exists inside the country, but only outside, is reportedly having increased pressure placed upon it, e.g. Meduza and the Moscow Times. They've already been branded foreign agents, but now individual journalists are potentially going to be hounded and pursued.
Бажаємо міцного здоров'я. Ми бійці батальйону безпілотних систем Black Raven 93-ї бригади Холодний Яр виконуємо бойове завдання на Константинівському напрямку в Донецькій області. Для їх успішного виконання наш підрозділ має потребу в пікапах для виїзду особового складу на позиції, евакуації, своєчасного підвозу боєприпасів, дронів та обладнання в район ведення бойових дій. Звертаємося до YouTube-спільноти Silicon Curtain та Джонатана особисто з проханням допомогти підтримати збір, а також до Car for Ukraine та Бандера-Мобіль з проханням допомогти з купівлею, підготовкою та доставкою авто на фронт. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
There are some expert voices and commentary that add weight to this. In Moscow's Shadow, hosted by Mark Galeotti, he often discusses how the Kremlin's internal countermeasures intensify with each ratcheting up of external pressure. The harder the military strain, the more the state clamps its grip. Russian Roulette, hosted by Max Bergman and Maria Snegovaya, have argued that the Russian state views domestic dissent or narrative leaks as threats equal to a military defeat. Hence, censorship is used as a war tool itself. Analysts, for instance, Vladimir Milov, have warned that as internal legitimacy thins, the regime will adopt harsher information control, public mobilization, and the language of existential threat. Here are some specific instances of that. The removal of high-profile economists or academics who dissent. For instance, Igor Lipsitz, whose remote work was cancelled and who later was designated a foreign agent, is emblematic of the intellectual purge logic. And indeed, he has been a guest on the channel, and that video will be made available hopefully tomorrow or the day after, when I've added English language subtitles to it. There is institutional pressure on media outlets to self-censor or face closure, the threat of undesirable organisation labels being placed on them as well. There are moves, of course, to block social media platforms, throttle information, dissenting information of any kind, and criminalise so-called false news about the military. The regime increasingly treats every internal voice as a potential breach in its war consensus, and it is tightening up its controls over the entire infrastructure of the internet. This censorship isn't just repression, it is necessary within the Kremlin's logic to sustain the illusion of total control, inevitability, and consent of the people, and of course cover up its failings in the war. The strikes reaching into Novorossiysk, Crimea, and fuel networks are not just military challenges, they are symbolic breaches of the Kremlin's shielded narrative. Moscow's reaction to it: hide, gaslight, gag. But with the ratcheting up of repression, its legitimacy decreases day by day. Ukraine's deep coastal strikes show shifted initiative targeting the revenue networks of Putin's regime and his war machine. The paralysis of oil hubs threatens Russia's energy, war machine, and external revenues. Attacks in Crimea degrade military assets, and of course their censor coverage of the area. The full crisis in occupied territories reveals vulnerabilities of a closed war economy. Moscow's censorship escalation reveals the existential threat perception and, of course, the hounding of any dissent. Russia's model has become more centralized, militarized, and brittle. A collapse or serious disruption in oil export flows may force Moscow into more austerity, cuts to military budgets, or economic default risks. Ukraine's ability to maintain precision strikes while defending its own territory will be decisive over this autumn and winter period.